Today we'll be speaking with Phil McGraw, also known as Dr. Phil, host of Dr. Phil Prime Time on Merit Street Media, and author of the new book, We've Got Issues, How You Can Stand Strong for America's Soul and Sanity. You know, I'm very interested to speak to you today because in preparation for our interview, I've been watching some of the Fox News appearances, looking at the book, etc. I never really saw you as a guy who delved into political issues per se. You seem more willing, interested, and I must say, maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because
A nice try, David Pakman. You tried to put my boy, Dr. Phil, into a corner, paint him as a right-wing conservative. He's Dr. Phil. He does whatever he wants to do. He doesn't have to have a political affiliation to have a take or even back a candidate. This is, of course, Dr. Phil McGraw on with David Pakman on the David Pakman Show. Dr. Phil is going to say, you're not going to put me in the boxing ring of philosophical ideas and have me in the corner. You know how they teach boxers to use your footwork and get your opponent in the corner so you can just get at them and they can't get away. Dr. Phil ain't having it. He's not political. He's just practical. Let's get back to Dr. Phil on with David Pakman.
I am so not political, you can't even believe it. And I'll tell you why. I know nothing about politics. And I know why you say that. It sounds like it.
Right.
I talk about these things as cultural issues from a psychological, psychosocial standpoint, how they affect families and people. And they do overlap with some of the things that politicians talk about, but they talk about it from a political standpoint, funding standpoint, how they can get this bill or that bill through. Couldn't care less. But I am interested in those issues in terms of how they impact families in their day-to-day pursuit of life and peace and being able to raise their family in a healthy environment. So there's a lot of overlap, but I don't talk about it from a political standpoint because I frankly don't know enough about the politics of it all.
That's
I'm just
interesting.
willing to admit that. I'm just willing to admit it. I don't think a lot of other people know either. I'm just willing to admit it.
I don't want to make this like, famously there's this story of literary critics were talking about the symbolism in Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, and he would tell them, that's not at all what I meant. And so I don't want to make this where I tell you about how political all the stuff you say is, but the reason why I say it is a lot of the language in the book and when you talk about issues like immigration and culture and others, it seems as though it alludes to going back to the good old days, individual decisions in the style that many Republicans now talk about with regard to schooling and parenting, et cetera. But you're saying it's just not the case.
Well, this is After Show Carnage, and David Pakman is one of those guys who tries very hard to sound smart. And I'm not saying he's not, but he's trying to sound smart. And I can't lie, it's kind of annoying. And I like this clash because Dr. Phil is not that guy. A very smart guy who comes across as a very normal guy. You wouldn't even know if you just saw him in the street. You probably wouldn't even know that he was a really bright doctor. He's going to answer this and dismantle. Dr. Phil is about to dismantle David Pakman on his own David Pakman Show.
No, and that doesn't mean that there aren't politicians on both sides of the aisle that talk about these issues. But if you really think about raising a family in America, whether it's now or 50 years ago or 20 years down the road, we still have to keep our eye on what I think are core issues in America. And I think the backbone of America is the family unit. I really think that if we have strong families, if we have strong family values, and I think that our families in America, as you've heard me say and read me say, are under attack. And I think some of those attacks are unintended consequences of technology, for example. But these are things that, whether politicians talked about them or not, if they tried to legislate about them or not, I would still be talking about.
So give some examples of that. What are
Yeah, David Pakman, it does make him a right winger. He has a certain culture that he values. Which part of that did you disagree with? The family structure is the backbone of this nation, of the country. Are you disagreeing with that, David Pakman? Give a like, comment, subscribe to the after show. Let's keep it going.
some of the attacks facing families?
Well, I think about 08, 09, we had what I think has been the biggest change to human life since the Industrial Revolution. I think before the Industrial Revolution, we were a very agricultural civilization, right? People worked on the farms. We grew what we needed. But then we became mechanized, and I think back then we were 95% agricultural. Now we're 1% agricultural. Why? Because everything is so mechanized and people move to the cities and all. Well, the biggest thing that's happened since then, in my opinion, was the advent of the smartphone. The internet became so prolific. And I mean, think about it. We're walking around in 08, 09 with as much computing power in our hands with smartphones, laptops, iPads, that we had when we did the moon shot. When we put a man on the moon, we didn't have as much computing power as we can hold in our hands as of 08, 09, and it changed everything. And people stopped being...
I hate to sidetrack, but I can't listen to this and ignore it. We sent a man to the moon. Okay. Let's continue on.
Being so involved with the reality of life and started getting involved in virtual life. And it's only gone more and more in that direction since that time. And also at that time, we started seeing the highest levels of anxiety, depression, and loneliness in young people since records were kept.
I'm with you on this.
And notice that none of that is political. Stay to the end. I'm going to talk about the evolution of Dr. Phil just a little bit at the end of this. Stay tuned.
I'm with you on this one. Jonathan Haidt has studied and written about this extensively. You and I are aligned on this one.
Good.
What about the ones that fall under what you call the tyranny of the fringe? Because I don't think the smartphone example falls under that category, right?
No, that's why I say some of this is the unintended consequences of like technology. But then we've got some where we've got people that are just trying to change some of the core values in America, core values of family, trying to rewrite history. And we've got people that are coming in saying, well, we want to change history, we want to change what kids are being taught in history, we want to change biology, we want to change all of the things that we have for 100 years had empirical data to support.
But tell me more. I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, pick an area. We can talk about biology where
That was a good question from David. If I'm going to criticize him, I'm also going to give him credit when credit is due. That was a good interview question. He's doing a good job with the interview. He's letting Dr. Phil talk. That was a good question to bring it back on topic. Let's get back to Dr. Phil and David Pakman.
We have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
So it was a good question, but the answer kind of stung a little bit. The answer was a little bit too good. I don't do this too often. I won't bring this back. This is, you look at the YouTube, you see at the bottom where the most replayed is. This is the most replayed clip here. Like, wait a second. You said, well, what's the history? Wait, that's not history? Let's replay what happened here with Dr. Phil, very subtly just destroying David Pakman here.
But tell me more. I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, pick an area. We can talk about biology where we have always had two sexes.
But what about
But
history?
now,
Just to pick history.
It goes back to Adam and Eve, David. What's more historical than that? What was the problem here? Help me out.
pick an area. We can talk about biology, where we have always had two sexes.
But what about
But
history?
now,
Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind.
Yeah.
We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery. We had one a group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation.
Right.
This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time, are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen.
And Dr. Phil's doing a great job here. I do have some slight disagreement here. Learn from the mistakes. Slavery was just a practice all throughout the world. I wouldn't look back at it as a mistake. It was just during that time. If America was the only country that did it, then I could look at more like a mistake. But no, it wasn't unique to the country. But what he's saying there was very interesting. He said, we're not teaching slavery right. And he said, how are we not doing it? We're taking down statue of Thomas Jefferson from New York City Hall. We're taking down other statues, Robert Lee. We're taking down these statues and we're not teaching. That's an interesting point here.
They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I understand,
crazy.
because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What
Okay.
I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again.
Dr. Phil just dismantled David Pakman on his own show in the most civil way possible. I'm going to end with Oprah Winfrey. That's what I think about when I look at Dr. Phil. I listen to Dr. Phil McGraw. I have a little timeline here. 1995, Oprah Winfrey hired Dr. Phil McGraw. That's in the wheelhouse. The 90s is like peak American culture. I'm 46. I remember the 90s very well. Oprah Winfrey, I remember all this very well, hired his legal consulting firm to assist her in a defense in a high-profile lawsuit involving the beef industry. Oprah Winfrey, I forgot what she said. I don't have it here. She said something bad about the beef industry. He came and helped. 3 years later, Oprah invited Dr. Phil to appear on the Oprah Winfrey Show, and she was impressed by his expertise and candid advice. He has a little charisma. He just has an understated charisma where he doesn't try too hard, but he resonates with people. Very likable. From 98 to 2002, he was a regular on Oprah because they loved him on Oprah. He was great on Oprah. He offered relationship, self-help advice that resonated with everybody. Then he went on with Oprah or Harpo Studios, did his show, the Dr. Phil show, and then now they kind of are in a different path. Dr. Phil appeared at a Donald Trump rally in October of 2024. Oprah Winfrey appeared at a Kamala Harris rally, and they kind of parted ways. But the cool thing is for them that they still talk, reportedly. Dr. Phil has still recently expressed gratitude for Oprah's influence. He seems like a very humble, grateful type of dude. And Dr. Phil represented well. After show carnage, we've got a little bit of a kind of an old guy at the YMCA posting up David Pakman and then doing the dream move, the dream shake on him and dropping him off. Let me know what you think.
Dr. Phil pulled a Hakeem Olajuwon dream shake on David Pakman, leaving him spinning in the paint of logic and culture. Classic after-show carnage.